Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are right now or when it is you're watching this. My name is Jay Shambaugh. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at GW. We here at IIEP are very pleased to be hosting this event on trade shocks and supply chains, what is happening to the WTO and globalization, with Speaker Bob Koopman, WTO Chief Economist, as part of our series of events on rebooting trade policy. And to once again be partnering with our co-sponsor, the Washington International Trade Association. So serving as Chief Economist at the WTO gives Bob a bird's eye view on a huge range of issues swirling around the trade world right now, and we're very excited to hear from him. For those of you who don't know us at IIEP, we're located at the Elliott School at GW, and we're a cross-disciplinary research center at GW. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization, a mandate we interpret rather broadly. That includes things around trade, international finance, development economics, poverty, climate change, and economic policy more broadly. And we've also had quite a bit of focus on both China's economy and India's economy. We have a number of speaker series and event series that you can find on our webpage. You can find upcoming events or past events and videos of those there as well. We have a number of events coming up, but for this crowd, I want to particularly note that we'll have former Congressman and former WTO Appellate Judge Jim Backus on March 23rd. So please take a look at that event. I'd like to acknowledge the IIEP Executive Circle for their support and welcome any members in attendance. And so without further ado, I'd like to kick off the event by turning things over to our moderator, Mike Moore. Mike is the founding director of IIEP and currently an IIEP faculty affiliate and GW economics professor. He's been a leader on our work on trade and our partnership with WTO. So Mike, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jay. And welcome again to all of our attendees today. The pandemic has been tragic on many levels, but it has opened our eyes to virtual events like this one, where participants can join us from around the world, including our distinguished speaker. It's my pleasure to welcome Chief Economist at the WTO, Bob Koopman, here today. I'm proud to say that he's been a long-standing friend. I won't say for how many years, but you have his bio in the email announcement, so you can see more details about his years of dedication to international trade, research, and public service. I'd like to reemphasize Jay's acknowledgement for two groups that help make this event possible. First, to our IIEP Executive Circle supporters, whose great advice and wisdom have shaped IIEP's series on rebooting trade, and we're always grateful for your help. And secondly, thanks to Ken Levinson and Diego Inez of the Washington International Trade Association, which is co-sponsoring this event. If you are interested in U.S. trade policy and aren't a member of WTO, then I hope you will join by close of business today. It's really an extraordinary group that has lots of trade policy relevant events weekly, multiple times weekly, really a great group. So a few logistics about the run of the show. After Bob's presentation, we'll open things up for a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button down here on Zoom to submit questions. I'll be consolidating similar queries and themes for Bob's responses, and we will end just at 1:45 Eastern Time. I want to keep in mind that Bob is many hours ahead of us in Geneva, and after a long day as WTO's Chief Economist. So now to our main attraction, Dr. Bob Koopman. Take it away, Bob.
Thanks a lot, Mike and Jay. It's great to be joining you guys. Don't know if you can see in the window behind me, but it's already dark here. But it's only 6:30, so only 6 hours different. So not too bad. Well, I didn't realize that this was called the Rebooting Trade Series. I find that very interesting. And I think one of the points I'm going to try to make in my presentation here is that trade has been subject to a lot of shocks, and trade has contributed some shocks, particularly in the past. But the foundation, the global rules that help underpin the global trading system, I would argue have been relatively resilient to both the political and the recent health pandemic-related shocks. So I find I often have to make this point. There's a lot of concern about the relevance and strength of the WTO, and it definitely is under challenge, and it definitely needs to adapt and change for more modern 21st century issues. But in many ways, the foundation agreements really do seem to be providing a good and pretty firm safety net for most trading relations. So let me go ahead and start sharing my slides. Hopefully this works like I did just moments ago. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these trade shocks and supply chains, what's happening to the WTO and globalization. So, recent developments, we saw a really rapid rebound of trade sharply as of June 2020. It started to slow in the last 2 quarters of 2021. And, we see that in our latest release of our trade barometer, which just came out yesterday. Still strong growth, but that growth has started to slow. So we see an outcome for 2021 that's going to be pretty close to our 10.8% rise in trade volume in 2021 from our October forecast. And but that is starting to fall a bit, and it could be much more in line with a slower but more normal rate of growth in trade for 2022. In early April 2022, we'll have our updated trade forecast, which will be my last trade forecast from the WTO. As Mike mentioned how old I am, I'm approaching the WTO's mandatory retirement age and will be departing here, but I get to do one last trade forecast here. The trade road recovery has been robust across products and geographical region, but it has been uneven. So it's been robust, but it's been stronger in the advanced economies and emerging market economies, but many least developed economies have had much slower recovery in the volume of trade growth. They have been supported by some price increases, particularly in commodity markets. And if we have time, I'll talk a little bit about inflationary pressures here from supply chain disruptions versus this next item here, this shift in demand. There's been a big shift in demand to tradable goods, durable and non-durable goods in the advanced economies, particularly the United States. That's put global shipping under great stress, particularly at ports like Los Angeles. We read a lot about that in the news. But much of that backup at Los Angeles also has to do with domestic US policies, rules, regulations around how the port operates, and health policy related rules perhaps around and their impacts on labor force, particularly trucking. So we see these rising container prices, this port congestion, and we hear about supply chain disruptions, but I'm going to argue that this is really much more about a strong increase in demand, along with some supply side constraints from COVID measures. There's been natural disasters and Ever Given type events, if one can ever forget that ship stuck in the Suez Canal. But I would argue that this is really, from the tradable goods side, much more about demand and psychological challenges. Services trade has yet to recover to pre-pandemic levels. It's affected by weaknesses in travel and tourism because of those health-related measures, but digitally supplied services are booming. So what we observed very early, in fact, we saw this in our trade forecast, the first one we rolled out after the pandemic. In our analysis, we saw, based on the scenarios we were implementing, a big shift from proximity-related services consumption towards tradable goods consumption. So we saw that in our modeling. It's really played out. It's played out much bigger than we expected because we did not necessarily anticipate such a strong fiscal and monetary policy support in the advanced economies and so quick. So we've seen import volumes weaker than expected in North America and Europe, which weighed on Asian exports. This is in late 2019 and early 2020. But you can see a fairly strong recovery going into the last 2 quarters of 2020 and the first 2 quarters of 2021, with some slowing tapering off in the 3rd quarter of 2021. Unfortunately, parts of the Middle East and Africa's recovery has been much slower compared to United States, Europe, and Asia. So higher energy prices have boosted trade values in Q3 and in Q4. They continue now, but we've seen growth diverging strongly across other products, with automobiles performing poorly, and that's particularly important for a region like Europe. So we've seen a number of manufacturers up very strongly. Agriculture did well, mining products have been doing well. Iron and steel saw a strong year-on-year growth. Pharmaceuticals and other chemicals were up. Electronic components were up despite the semiconductor challenges, but we saw automotive products, telecommunications equipment adversely affected by the semiconductor shortages, and clothing and textiles being relatively weak. The bottlenecks in shipping appear to be easing as throughput has plateaued at high levels and prices have started to moderate. We look at a number of real-time indicators here at the WTO. It's something we started adapting about 4 or 5 years ago, but really came to help us a lot in this COVID times. And I even look at things like what's happening in used car auctions in the United States and property markets. And maybe I'll come to some of the property market aspects when we talk about inflation. So you can see that there's been a recovery in semiconductor shipments that could presage a recovery in automotive products trade. Hasn't gotten there yet, but we think that there is going to be some improvements there. And again, if you look at the press reports, some automobile manufacturers say that things seem to be easing there and that they expect to be able to increase output in the coming months. The global manufacturing purchases managers indices also show some cooling, and that's a good sign in terms of demand and prices potentially cooling. In these inflation components around durable goods and non-durable goods, these tradable goods, which for decades have been relatively stable components of inflation, have spiked dramatically here in the last 1.5 years. So, as I said, services activity remains depressed compared to the pre-pandemic period, we had this compositional shift in spending towards goods. There's been a bit of recovery, largely driven by digital services. That's going very strongly. There's been some recovery in air freight and passenger air traffic, although Omicron slowed that again, but we start to see the world opening up, and we hear from both the air cargo and air passenger airlines that they are increasing the number of flights. So now what I want to talk about is how does trade impact, or the trade impacts of shocks remain pretty heterogeneous. So I mentioned earlier that trade can contribute to shocks, but trade can also help mitigate shocks. And we did a World Trade Report here, 2021, looking at the impact of trade and economic resilience. And, you know, as always, when it comes to trade, there are positive aspects and there are negative aspects. Sometimes through global value chains, a big drop in demand in advanced economies, like we saw in the global financial crisis, can be spread throughout the global economy and have adverse effects through that demand shock working through trade shocks into other economies and spilling on into economies that are very indirectly participating in GVCs and intermediate goods, but provide the upstream raw materials and commodities for those goods. You could see in the chart on the right that there was a big drop in global trade following the great financial crisis, a pretty rapid recovery through 2011. And then there was a slowing of the rate of recovery. So if you look at, say, 2005 to 2009, the slope there was growing very steeply. And then in the recovery, starting in late 2009 through 2012, that slope looks like it was getting back on track. But then say 2012 to 2015, the rate of growth started to taper. We had recession in there, or slowing global economy, trade disruptions from the previous US administration, lots of uncertainty, and trade dropped again. It started to recover just prior to the COVID crisis. And then you can see there was a big drop immediately, but a pretty quick recovery and then some tapering here. So trade's performance for a while, if you were sitting in 2012, a couple of years before I joined the WTO, you'd say, well, there was a shock, but GVCs are getting back on track. And then you could see that there was a tapering, maybe globalization was slowing. Hey, wait a second, globalization in 2016 starts to be under attack. Global trade drops, but is, sort of stable with some ups and downs there. And then a recovery, which I think surprised many people as the political uncertainties from that 2016 to 2018 period seemed to be overcome as firms and the global economy got back on track. And then COVID hit. So when we look at the shocks and their impacts on trade and trade's impact on the global economy or domestic economies, we have to take a look at what kind of shock are we talking about? What does that do to global trade costs and local trade costs? And we always compare domestic trade costs to international trade costs. And then how does that filter through imports and exports? So there are different types of channels. There are different types of sectors. There are different initial conditions. And then there are different policy responses from economic, infrastructure, energy, environmental, social, health, and trade policy responses. So it's there's quite a diversity of aspects here that one has to pay attention to and try to sort through their impacts. Now, from the WTO perspective, when COVID hit, there was a lot of concern. Well, COVID following, say, the US-China trade tensions, US-Europe trade tensions, and those rising trade tensions in general. And then COVID hit, and we saw a lot of export restrictions being put in place. So a lot of trade restrictive measures were put in place, about 136. By mid-June of 2021, more than half of them were gone, and now that number is around 45 trade restrictions remaining in force. So about 2/3 have been removed. And those could be export restrictions, customs procedures, import restrictions, local content, and trade opening measures. There were quite a few. There were more trade facilitating measures. Look at the left-hand side. There were 248 put in compared to 136 as of mid-2021, and only 53 of those were phased out. So more of the export restricting measures were phased out, and even more are gone now. And we still see quite a few of the trade facilitating measures remaining in place. So I would say that while the WTO foundational agreements may not have operated ideally, I think they operated within the bounds. These measures were frequently allowed in the agreements. But there was transparency around them, and members who imposed them had to expose themselves to questions and concerns from other members and have a broad discussion, transparent debate, lots of assessments of their economic effectiveness. And I think that that helped make many governments realize that those trade restricting measures were counterproductive. So if we look at economic resilience as a dynamic concept, the impact can be mitigated by preparation. In fact, we in the World Trade Report, we use PCR, not for PCR tests, but for being prepared, having coping strategy, and then effective recovery policy. So preparing, coping, and recovering. And preparing means what you're doing beforehand. and actually I'm going to foreshadow a conclusion here. Now is the time to be preparing global supply chains, global health policies for the next shock. Wherever that source may come from, whether it's a health shock, many people expect some other kind of health shock down the line, a climate-related shock, a policy uncertainty shock, as we saw starting at about 2016. The key element is to start preparing now so that you can better cope when that shock hits. And if you can cope better, then the negative aspect of the shock will be mitigated. And then if you have better recovery policies in place, you can get a much faster recovery. And I think there's lots of lessons to be learned here about preparation, coping, and recovering. And clearly there's lots for governments to learn about here. On the health front, I recall back in the mid to late 2000s, there was lots of discussions around bird flu and trying to prepare the global economy for those kinds of health-related shocks. Lots of investment in sort of coordinating global health policies. And then I think people forgot about it. It wasn't front and center. And a lot of the preparation that should have been sustained was allowed to fall away. And then when COVID hit, we were not as well prepared. We didn't cope as well. And I think there's lots of lessons around recovering. So, but those strategies apply, as I said, whether it's climate related, natural disaster, health, or even a policy uncertainty shock. But trade can contribute to spreading shocks. So pandemics can spread through trade of live animals, travel and tourism. Our people would argue that that was a big source of the spread of COVID. But we've also learned that permanent restrictions to travel are costly, though, and that illicit trade in livestock and wildlife cause most of the historical problems that we've observed on the health front in terms of the spread of pandemics. Volatility of trade costs, such as swings in transport costs, what we're observing right now, and trade policies can make trade a source of those kinds of shocks. So ensuring that you have stable and predictable trade policies are crucial to limit the role of trade in the spread of shocks. And one of the things I would argue is that while the WTO foundational agreements are pretty well, operated pretty well, there's big lessons around policies around physical infrastructure, but also regulatory infrastructure. And there can be improvements in the regulatory infrastructure of the WTO, but there's lots of regulatory improvements and opportunities outside of the WTO that would facilitate the ability of structured trade that addresses the sources of the concern and yet facilitates the movement of people, goods, and services. And there's lots of lessons to be learned there. And hopefully both on the domestic front and in the international cooperation front, we'll see some movements there. Now, trade is responsible for a small share of greenhouse gas emissions through transportation, though trade is also part of the solution for climate change through the diffusion of green technologies, particularly the best technologies at the lowest cost, and trade facilitates the adaptation of climate change related shocks in terms of, in fact, earlier today we had a technical meeting between a bunch of international organizations on modeling carbon emissions and policies to help mitigate carbon, things like carbon taxes and CBAMs and things like that. And it's very interesting how, when one looks at the future scenarios around climate change, some countries that have very strong focus on building out domestic food security or reliance on domestic food security are very likely to be adversely affected by climate change shocks in the agricultural sector. So trade's likely to be a much bigger source of recovery for them and mitigation of those shocks. So as I said, trade can also help prepare for, cope with, and recover from shocks. It expands resources available to prepare for shocks, facilitates sufficient supply of things like weather forecast services, insurance, telecommunications, logistics, and health services. And then it plays a critical role in the quick provision of essential goods during crises such as the pandemic. We've seen a huge spike in the trade of medical goods. We have a vaccine trade tracker on our website. You can see that while the distribution, geographic distribution of vaccine production may be fairly limited, the ability of those sources, current sources of vaccine production to scale up has been rather amazing. And trade and exports of vaccines has been very, very critical to helping mitigate the spread of the virus and mitigate the domestic shocks, although it was uneven and there's lots of lessons there on how to prepare for the future and do a better job. Trade promotes specialization, knowledge spillover, speeding up the developments of products required during the crisis, such as vaccines. And then trade, through trade, countries can benefit from sustained foreign demand on the export side and the availability of intermediate inputs on the import side. The big fiscal and monetary stimuluses in the advanced economies has spilled over and assisted those developing, least developed countries that don't have the fiscal and monetary space to be able to benefit from what's been going on in the advanced economies. I think I'll skip this slide, but take a look at our World Trade Report 2021. I'll ask IIEP to share the slides. That's an active link there, WTO, WTR 2021. What we observed is that trade linkages helped to accelerate GDP growth during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the share of trade with countries having a low number of COVID cases went up, and it facilitated GDP growth. Trade diversification, we found, reduces macroeconomic volatility. So the more diversified you are in terms of trading, the less volatile your macroeconomic environment is. These are correlations, you know, it's hard to pin down causation here, but these correlations are pretty powerful. Now, we also contributed to something called the GVC Development Report 2021, and it was about global value chains beyond production. And an interesting thing that we do in this report is regularly update what's happening in terms of the relationships of in global value chains. And on the left-hand side, this is the global value chain perspective in 2005 and 2016 from a supply perspective. For the top two charts there, the two circle graphs represent domestic manufacturing firms. In 2005, you can see the US, Japan, and Germany were the centers of global supply for global value chains. By 2016, for domestic manufacturing firms, China had risen and was at the center of a very large integrated chain, with Germany and the US still playing big roles. If you looked at Europe more closely, you'd see a big rise in Central and Eastern Europe. The role of multinational manufacturing firms has also seen a rise from China. Germany and the US remain big players. If you look at it on the demand perspective, what I find very interesting in this is a much bigger role for the United States on the demand side. In 2005, it's been sustained through 2016, whether it's all domestic manufacturing firms and all multinational manufacturing firms. So if we're looking at global value chains going forward, I would argue that by the time you get to 2026, 2030, in order to have more balance in global supply chains, we're going to need to see China become a much bigger source of demand in global value chains. And that's going to be a big question and one to watch closely. Do we see China transitioning? It has grown some. It was a player in 2005, and it's still a player in 2016. But the size of those bubbles has not changed anywhere near as much as on the supply side. So do we start to see China becoming a bigger player on the demand side? If you look at services, so this is the same layout for services, the US is central in services along with Germany. Germany's multinational firms are very big players in services on the bottom side, but in the US, for all domestic services firms, they're a big player. And again, the US remains the biggest source of demand in global value chains. So US policies really matter here, and they can have big effects. But what we found, particularly if you look at the literature around the Trump administration's tariffs, is that it resulted in trade diversion as opposed to reshoring. There may have been some nearshoring in that trade diversion, but we saw very little movement in the data back to the United States. I'm going to skip this recent trends in global value chains, but essentially what it says is that global value chain participation continues to rise. And that actually China's as a center for global manufacturing assembly has declined a bit between 2010 and 2019. And some of that is offshoring from China to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Mexico. So let me conclude. It was a tour de force, maybe too fast, but trade's been remarkably resilient in the face of both political and health shocks. Not perfect, certainly not on that, what some people call the long 1990s rapid rate of growth that saw the rise of global value chains, but it really hasn't retreated. It's been relatively stable with some good explanatory shocks that describe some of the movements. Trade's been played a big role in moving medical goods from fairly concentrated, efficient production sites to widely dispersed demands. Policies played a role in the initial disruptions, but have had limited impacts over the medium to long term. Still room for improvement going forward. And the concept of economic resilience and trade's role in building it is complex, but thoughtful preparation, coping and recovering strategies, and importantly, coherence between domestic and international health, economic, environment, and trade policies can make a positive difference. And there's a lot of substance to focus on there to think about how we can make this coherence better. In a place like the United States, one certainly needs to be thinking about the domestic safety net and labor-related policies, worker-related policies instead of job-related policies that can help improve the coherence and sustainability of globalization. Now, the macro drivers aside, the implications for emerging market economy growth suggests that trade and trade policies, while stressed, still remain a positive force for growth. With the trade diversification that we're seeing, it opens up opportunities for other developing and least developed countries to potentially create an environment to integrate into global value chains. Global value chains are not passé. They're what we like to refer to here at the WTO is they're reorganizing. And what we see is a reorganization of globalization, not a retrenchment of or a retraction from globalization. So I don't see the fundamental forces of comparative advantage and efficiency becoming irrelevant. I do see that there'll be an increase in risk mitigation, whether from policy uncertainty to health to climate approaches that may offset an historical laser-like focus on production efficiency, and that trade will likely to continue to play its role in contributing to global growth and helping find relatively efficient solutions to global commons challenges caused by climate and health developments. There's a lot more I could say, but let me stop there and open it up to questions. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Bob. That was a a rapid fire overview of really a fascinating time for trade. I think anybody that's involved in international trade has found the last couple of years both terrifying and fascinating. So, and you're in the middle of it. So, got lots of questions coming in, but I do want to start with kind of a big picture question about the relatively good response from during COVID compared to the global financial crisis. So trade came back pretty quickly. And I mentioned this to you before, but you can think of at least three different scenarios of why that might have been. You know, one, there might be something different about a pandemic. And so that's very different than a global financial crisis, which shocks are transmitted through the financial system. It could be macroeconomic policies are very different. Maybe the stimulus was too small in 2008, 2009, or maybe firms have learned to adapt to shocks better, moving things around in ways to mitigate that. I'm sure there are other alternatives, but any sense of the overall source of that relatively better performance? So you've touched on some of this in the presentation, but I just wanted to just kind of get that basic question out there.
So Mike, I think the biggest contributors were the fiscal stimulus and the monetary accommodation, right? Massive in the COVID response and quick compared to 2008, 2009. The increase in liquidity kept firms able to access credit and continue to be able to get working capital and keep production going. And then, you know, the sustained demand. In fact, firms were shocked. I think firms like me thought, oh my goodness, we're going to see that shock from the great financial crisis all over again. And there was a precipitous drop, but the recovery was very, very quick. And I mean, historically, when we looked at these kinds of questions, I remember having this discussion with, you remember, folks from USTR, you know, only about 25% of trade growth can be attributed to trade policy changes. Most of trade growth really is about what's happening to economic growth broadly in GDP and the components of demand. So we had that big fiscal and monetary response in the health crisis, combined with the health policies that prevented people from spending money on proximity-related services. So they couldn't go on vacation, they couldn't go to the theater, they couldn't go out to eat. And you know, firms were very innovative, particularly those that could shift to remote provision. You know, restaurants shifted to takeout orders and things like that. And some government policies were very good at adapting. You know, restaurants could also not only have takeout food, but in some places they could have takeout booze, which was something that many local governments, you know, wouldn't have thought about doing had it not been such a crisis. But that compositional shift in demand for proximity-related services, and as you know, services is a much bigger share of consumption than expenditures on durable and non-durable goods. Much of that shifted to durable and non-durable goods. And they had money, but not everybody did, unfortunately, but a number of households did. We saw savings build up instead of being drawn down. And so you combine the fiscal and monetary, the massive and rapid fiscal and monetary response with the unique aspects of the COVID health policy shifting, making a compositional shift in demand. And I think that's why you've seen trade recover and actually stress global supply chains. Keep in mind, more trade is moving now than has ever moved before. And people say, well, there's supply chain disruptions. Yes, there are some, but I would say that supply chains are stressed by the excess demand much more than they're disrupted by supply disruptions on the trade side. there are domestic supply disruptions, and we could talk about what's happened to the labor force, the workforce, and things like that, that are also contributing to inflationary expectations and things like that. But I think it's pretty clear what's happening on the trade side.
And just a clarifying question: was the graph that you had with the recovery of global trade, was that goods or goods and services?
That was goods, I believe. No, that was goods and services.
Okay, all right, thank you. And so another question, this actually follows on something that Susan Aronson sent questions to you.
Thanks, Susan.
That, just really about the WTO's internal response to dealing with global shocks. Some clearly you had to improvise early on because you weren't expecting this. But are there any permanent changes in the structure of the Secretariat, just generally, that makes this more of an ongoing effort to build resilience?
You talked about exciting times. One of the assignments I was given after the COVID shock was to coordinate a cross-secretariat effort to gather information and analysis on what was happening in COVID. So all of our divisions contributed expertise and focused allocating resources to trying to make sure that WTO members had good information about what the agreement said and what was happening in terms of policy developments. So it was fairly unique undertaking here at the Secretariat to put together. Normally we work for a division here works for a particular committee, and some would say we're siloed. And this cross-cutting effort was really a very innovative way to cut across those silos. And what we discovered is that by cutting across the silos, we learned a lot from each other and actually advanced our knowledge and insights by learning from one another. And there's some other efforts along those lines that were going on at about the same time, but not as high visibility. But yes, I think the Secretariat has been permanently affected. Now have a new Director General, DG Ngozi, and she's very interested in figuring out how we improve the functioning of the Secretariat to better meet members' needs.
Okay. And I also have to jump ahead a little bit because Judy Dean is asking you a question about the evidence on GVC's and trade diversion rather than reshoring, and how could that be measured, and it's the associated costs with the diversion. It's not a trivial activity to move your supply chain around, but any sense of how those things have been measured?
Well, so in a very simple way, what we look at is the composition of exports in certain sectors and where are they being sourced from. Now, more sophisticated empirical approaches get rolled out in things like that GVC Beyond Production report and things like that, and we still see it with more sophisticated approaches. But in those efforts around more sophisticated approaches, there is some debate. But if you just look at the pure trade numbers in certain sectors, you see increasing exports in products that used to be mainly sourced from China. You now see them being sourced from Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Mexico. You've got level effects as trade's being shocked, so you do have to use some of the more sophisticated approaches. But I'm waving my hands here a bit, but it's pretty clear that there's been very little reshoring, much more trade diversion, and where was I going to go with this? Yes, some of this had started before the Trump policies. It got accelerated by the Trump policies, but it started before as wages in China started to rise. And so there was a lot of natural outward FDI as Chinese firms looked to try to exploit lower cost labor and production costs in other developing countries. So we had already started to see that kind of trend. It was exacerbated, accelerated by the policy uncertainty under the previous US administration. And then lots of firms have sat down because of the COVID crisis. And I mean, every consulting firm I know out there is doing a supply chain sensitivity analysis, right? At very, very micro levels, and trying to help firms, particularly big multinationals, know where there may be supply chain choke points. And what they're realizing is that there are two approaches to this. Build inventories, well, three approaches. Build inventories, diversify your suppliers. And then the third one is, can we use things like 3D printers to print critical components to finish a product, even if that's not how we want to sustain production in the long run. It allows us to finish that $40,000 pickup truck if we can print the that key component and get that truck off the lot.
So we often think about global value chains from a U.S. perspective, where we're trying to diversify our sources for critical components, but this also plays a role in international sanctions. Germany apparently today has announced at least a suspension of the natural gas pipeline from Russia, and so that was really a possibly over-reliance on one source of natural gas. Russia might have an incentive then to diversify into sending exports to China. So this really gets into some of the geopolitics of the diversification of supply chains generally. Now, that I know that's not the WTO's bailiwick necessarily, but it is striking to see how there are ways in which the value chains are being affected by geopolitical pressures and not just economic realities or worries about a pandemic, that there are these other factors. And so just any comments about that generally, and also in terms of the effectiveness of sanctions in altering behavior.
Yeah, well, I think Yodo and co-authors have a paper out where they've looked at the impact of sanctions, and I won't try to summarize it here, but they found that sanctions do have direct and indirect effects. And often the effects that they intend to have can be found in the data. But then there are these secondary effects that are a bit unexpected. But the idea that national security elements, filter into the trade sphere is not new, it's not unusual. The whole idea of something like the WTO and even regional trade agreements, I think, is to try to create those commercial ties to ensure that we don't over politicize them. But there's always going to be that political element. And the WTO has exceptions that countries can use. We think that the solution to those security issues are political, not necessarily technical. And we'd rather members negotiate them and try to keep trade flowing as freely as possible. But as freely as possible does not necessarily mean absolutely free. So I think the WTO is created recognizing there would be these challenges, and the idea was to try to reduce the amount of trade that was affected by them. I think it was reasonably successful, but as the world has changed and the global economy has changed, I think members are now looking for ways to come to a new equilibrium around these issues. Some of that may result in an improvement of the WTO. Some of it may result in negotiations outside of the WTO. And I would argue that the WTO is not the solution to every problem. Far from it. It's got a core mission, and it should focus on that.
Yeah, so in the U.S., there's bipartisan support for more Buy American type policies or financial support for semiconductors and medical supplies, so forth. I assume that sort of thing is going on in other countries. Now, this reflects both broad skepticism about globalization, but it's also maybe certainly related to the recent crisis. How is the WTO keeping track of those efforts? It may be difficult to distinguish old style protectionism and legitimate security concerns or whatever, but are keeping track concerned about that going forward? Not to put you in a position of and of course we should have said at the beginning, Bob is only speaking for himself and not as a representative of the WTO. That goes for things said before as well.
Yeah. So good question, Mike. We have a trade monitoring exercise where not only do we report on the official notifications that come in to the WTO, but we gather other information that we think is potentially impacting global trade flows. And we ask members, hey, what do you think about, is this policy something that you're doing? So we go beyond just the official notifications. But we don't, as a secretariat, make any determination about that. We think it's just helpful to gather this kind of information. There are other sources out there. A number of IOs gather this kind of data. There's the Global Trade Alert that Simon Evanet's shop does that captures a lot more. We could capture that kind of information, by the way. There's nothing magical to it, although it's a great effort by Simon and his team. But WTO members, have different views of what the Secretariat should do. And, some of them feel, hey, the only thing the Secretariat should do is collect the information that members give. Often those same members are saying other members aren't giving the information and they need to give it. We're sitting there saying, we can actually find that information. But, it is a debate. What's the role of the Secretariat in supporting members' efforts versus what's the responsibilities of the individual members? But we do pay attention to that. We care about that. On the research side, we look at those kinds of questions a lot. One of the things I would say, Mike, is, you mentioned some of the, I mentioned earlier that we have this trade cost initiative where we look at trade costs. And when we measure those trade costs, we're looking at domestic versus international versus domestic trade costs, right? Sort of classic Anderson Van Wynkoop kind of trade costs from a gravity model, taken a number of steps forward. But if you think about this closely, you can observe that a number of WTO members have invested in reducing their domestic trade costs, and that helps reduce their international trade costs, right? So if you got really efficient infrastructure, ports, roads, if you've got well-functioning institutions that do things efficiently, that really does help your global competitiveness, reducing your trade costs. If you haven't been investing in those kinds of things, so this gets to something called the level playing field. Other countries may make the playing field unlevel by cheating, but you may also contribute to an unlevel playing field by not investing in the kinds of things that made you competitive to begin with. Some of that might be fundamental R&D. It could be roads, it could be ports, it could be things like that. And then finally, it's been my observation that almost every WTO member has areas where they would be very sensitive. You see this in TPRs. I don't think any member goes through a trade policy review without getting some pretty critical questions and comments from other WTO members. So they all live in a glass house and they should be careful about what stones they decide to throw.
So question, about as Bob Feinberg, questions about trade remedies. So those, my understanding of, at least in the U.S., that's been a good industry to be involved in if you're a trade lawyer. I don't know what the global trends are, but you mentioned a number of actions, trade restricting actions being taken off. I assume much of that is not anti-dumping issues, or maybe it is, I don't know. But any information about those broad trends of administered protection?
Well, it seems to be rising. And one source of that rise is the United States. I think another source is India and some other developing countries. So, those are generally WTO legal and compliant things that members can do. So there's often a debate about how a member goes about it, and that can often result in a dispute. And I'm sure Jim Bacchus will talk some about that, maybe. And I'd be all ears for that. But, historically, they've been a small share of global trade. They were a small share of US trade for many years. Even if you accounted for sort of the effect they might have in terms of preventing trade from a precautionary perspective. But relatively small share of trade that you allowed to be targeted with this administrative protection in order to allow for broader liberalization. And in the end, I think that trade-off has been on net, from a grand scale, very positive for the global economy, particularly if it allowed for broader liberalization, which it seems to have in exchange for targeted protection when the domestic political and economic scene seems to justify it.
So I'd be remiss in not asking a related question about the Appellate Body. So that has been the WTO has not been the primary forum for trade negotiations in the last, well, really since the Uruguay round. It's been more at the regional and preferential trade agreements of various types. But there had been a very robust Appellate Body system for settling disputes. That's been problematic recently. Any movement on that that you could share with us?
Well, I think what you have to watch is, what does the U.S. want? And I think former Ambassador Shea gave a speech here recently to a group in India that got played up in the press, where he went through and sort of articulated what he thought the problems with the Appellate Body were. And he didn't see any easy solutions in the current negotiating context. Catherine Tai, I think, has not been as detailed in her description as to what she sees as the challenges, but when you look at what she says, they seem correlated to what Ambassador Shea said. So that's the best source in terms of trying to figure out where that's going to go. Countries are still bringing disputes, right? So despite the fact that the Appellate Body is not there and countries can appeal into the void, there is also the multi-party interim agreement that some WTO members have agreed to, which has potential interest there for those members that want to participate. But countries still bring disputes and are still trying to sort that out and litigate it here at the WTO. And I think it's an important question. Do you need the Appellate Body in order to ensure that the WTO rules are, will this be the Wild West of global trade now? I think only time will tell. What negotiators do here, I think it's hard to predict. And my observation for the last 8 years is they can be rather surprising at times, but it is hard to get 164 members to agree on anything. And by the way, Mike, just some data out there, over 80% of global trade occurs on WTO rules and tariffs, right? So, and that part that occurs under RTAs, the core elements in the RTAs are WTO DNA. It may reduce tariffs a bit more, but those tariffs don't account for anywhere near the amount of global trade that's done under WTO tariff commitments. And 50 percentage points of that 80 are WTO zero. So there's nothing to gain from an RTA except in those deeper sort of behind the border regulatory issues, which can be very important, I must admit.
So looking forward, the climate change, the climate pressures, and the interactions between trade rules and climate policies are a potential source of some of tension. Has there been lessons learned in the pandemic that would help WTO as an institution and also the members deal with the pressures that come about from this kind of external shock? It's not an economic policy. It's something that is from outside of the trading system, arguably. Useful lessons, new problem, got to do things very differently. What has there been things learned for climate?
Well, I do think there have been some important lessons around global cooperation. And I think the WTO is often held up at the GATT and then the creation of the WTO as a great example of global cooperation to try to solve global common issues. But there is a view among members that this should really be restricted to trading goods and services and that commercial transaction, and not really try to solve some of these other problems. But I think that is changing. I think people are starting to realize that some of those trade and issues are pretty important. And if you look at the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement, it does set out a pretty broad set of objectives. The implementing agreements from the GATT and those that added with the Uruguay round are pretty focused. But I think increasingly people are starting to realize, trade and global tax policy matters. Trade and, capital flows really are related. And trade and climate change, you can't look at them separately. And we've observed from the health crisis that you certainly cannot separate these things out. The question is how do we go forward in these new areas, and how do you bring about movement towards some new solutions? And it's a challenging thing, and I know our DG is very interested in getting members to think about new solutions to this kind of thing. It's not up to the Secretariat to give those solutions. It's up to members to find them. The DG does think one of the roles of the Secretariat is to help give information, facts, analysis to help inform those discussions. And I will say one of the things that worries me here is that often the discussions don't do a good enough job of regularly bringing in a flow of knowledge and facts and information into those discussions. So things like our World Trade Reports can be very, very helpful, but delegates are busy. They often have multiple challenges. And we as a Secretariat need to find a way to make sure that they can digest. They don't have time to read a 200 or 300 page report. So how do we engage with them to learn from this and figure out potential solutions to go forward? And I think one way we seem to be observing is different coalitions coming together and trying to develop some common positions, and then you get coalitions negotiating, which can make it a bit easier perhaps than, a free-for-all between, 100, 164 members.
I mean, clearly an area where there's much more sensitivity now than in previous decades is the potential disparate impact of trade, both positive and negatively towards, for example, women or marginalized groups. I know that for DG Ngozi, those are important issues, but is there anything that you could share with this group about initiatives that the WTO is taking for empowering women or dealing with particularly vulnerable populations in, say, the developing world? Just anything? It's kind of a broad question, but I would be curious about that.
Well, we do have a Trade and Gender Initiative, which a number of members started in Buenos Aires. And what year was that? I can't remember now. I think 2018. As well as a MISME joint initiative. And in those initiatives, what they're trying to do is not create necessarily new obligations, but looking at existing obligations or ones that are being negotiated in other venues, other committees, and thinking about what might the impacts of those be on women, marginalized groups, small firms, those kinds of things. And I think that's an example of members responding to recognizing that they need to bring different perspectives into their negotiations and discussions in a coordinated way to make sure that these things don't get overlooked. So I think that's a positive development. It's really at its early stages, but I'm pretty optimistic that those things are going to play a more positive role. Not going to solve all the problems. A big part here, Mike, I think, is that many of those problems need much better domestic policies. But you need to have coherence between your domestic and your international policies. So it's good that they're being brought up here, but they also need a domestic solution. And that's where I think you'll see much more sort of rubber hitting the road in terms of creating more change. But that doesn't mean that the global trading system can't be a facilitating element in that evolution and affecting that change. But I don't think it can be the silver bullet.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, Bob, I want to. We've taken enough of your time, and dinner is probably waiting for you in Geneva. Really do appreciate what was an optimistic view of the current state of trade, the WTO's role in that. All very encouraging. So thank Bob, and I want to certainly invite all the participants to take advantage of all of the events that IIEP undertakes in international trade, international macro development. The easiest way to find out is just Google or do a search engine for GW and IIEP. You will find many interesting events that we undertake, not just in trade, but in these other issues as well. Especially, I want to thank Bob again for his participation today. And thanks to all the people who had great questions. So take care, folks.